Tilda, let's talk today about YouTube relationships. More specifically, about public perception of the relationships between YouTubers who operate within the same or similar spheres of content creation. Because I've noticed a trend and I find it rather interesting regarding viewers and how they seem to think their favorite content creators work with each other. Obviously, this is coming from my own perspective and experience, so this viewpoint may not reflect the opinion of other content creators. Indeed, it is not supposed to, but I think that this highlights a very unusual view that people have, and perhaps even highlights the tribalistic nature of people and the need that people seemingly have to dichotomize things, falsely or not. So, a bit of background here. Within the loosely defined grouping of anti-feminism, MRAs, MGTOW, PUAs, there is overlap, and there is also disagreement. And there have certainly been disagreements between people within these different camps, and even disagreements with people within the same camps. And I use the term camps here loosely just to illustrate the point. And something I find most intriguing is the public reaction when a disagreement or even a simple misunderstanding happens. By virtue of what I do on YouTube, finding evidence to either reinforce or deconstruct a point or position held by either myself or others, there inevitably follows disagreement and misunderstanding. In some cases, these can be valid, either through someone having presented valid evidence to the contrary of other data, or simply through a point not being articulated clearly enough or expanded upon enough, although in some cases time constraints prevent covering a single facet of a larger topic in as much depth as is sometimes warranted. But in other cases, the disagreement or misunderstanding comes from ideological reaction, emotional bias, or simply an unwillingness to even attempt to engage with the material presented. Should the source of this disagreement come from a perceived outside group or other camp, for example a feminist or social justice supporter, or even the creator of a video that was originally questioned, then any response will be met with cheers from the public and adulations for the poning or the glory of the takedown, or some other cheer similar to those of a Colosseum audience seeing their gladiator of choice eviscerate another. However, when the disagreement or misunderstanding comes from someone in the same perceived camp, or from some inside group as it were, then the reaction is very different. Suddenly, the audience member is confronted by two people they like, moving in some other way than total lockstep with the audience member's perception of them as a supposed united front, and this brings several points to the table that I'd like to address herein. When these disagreements or misunderstandings happen, I sometimes see desperate pleas for bargaining, and the cries out for a unified front to be presented, often couched in some us versus them phrase. Why are you fighting with each other? The real enemy is feminism, for example, as if the existence of some perceived greater evil should prevent any sort of disagreement or improvement of your own ideas from others who may share a basic ideological or moral view with yourself. Other times, it's a kind of shocked reaction of, why are you fighting, with no plea to some greater reason not to. It seems odd that two people that someone likes disagreeing or misunderstanding should cause someone such emotional upset. I've often seen it likened to a family, indeed with some people even stating, why are mom and dad fighting, on whatever issue the disagreement or misunderstanding has happened over. This obviously shares with the previous point the idea that these two content creators should, for some undisclosed and ultimately irrational reason, be in some way a unified force. The final point, before I go on to really reach into the depths of this, is the instant demand for immediate action, which seems to come in two forms. The demand for instant peace, or the demand for instant blood, both of which share one commonality that I'll get to shortly. The demand for peace is, as it sounds, a demand for instant amicable resolution, rather than any sort of further conversation on the issue, the instant cessation of any dialogue to expand the point and simply sweep it under the rug as if the disagreement or misunderstanding never took place. Something I find most curious from a community that is supposed to pride itself on rationality and skepticism, and always being willing to consider evidence and approach any topic with as much nuance as possible, when this demand for peace approach is the polar opposite. This approach is usually proposed by some private contact between the two parties, and the demand that they basically just shake hands and agree to disagree. The call for blood is also much as it sounds. The instant dogpiling on any form of social media both parties have, demanding instant Google Hangouts or broadcast Skype calls, pulling in other content creators from all around with demands that they moderate, which in this instance is more like a demand to referee the ensuing battle. Although this may partly just be a selfish desire to have more content to watch, featuring people whose content they enjoy, for which people can hardly be blamed. All of these outcomes work from one simple and ultimately incorrect premise that many people seem to have about their favorite content creators, especially when they share a similar sphere of content creation. That we all know each other, that we all ultimately like each other, and that we all share some sort of constant connectivity to each other, as well as some sort of misguided belief that we must all necessarily be on the same side, whatever that means. This sort of fallacious thought can most easily be demonstrated looking through @mentions on social media and fan art of content creators being mentioned together, drawn together, and generally associated with each other by their fans when no actual contact between those content creators exists. Indeed, on the rare occasions when I've had disagreement or even a simple misunderstanding with anyone with whom I move in a similar circle, the amount of instant cries for live conversation is staggering and hinges on the misconception that we already know each other and communicate semi-regularly. I have even had several people just outright state something along the lines of, "Why not just call X person on Skype? I'm sure you've got their number already." I find this most unusual, and it makes me question a few things. Mostly, do I occupy some sort of unusual position in this sphere of content creators where I don't speak to very many of them? The list of YouTube content creators I've had any sort of direct contact with could be counted by barely touching double digits, and the number with whom I have any semi-regular contact, by which I mean once or twice a month messages, could be counted on a single hand, and those I've worked with even less still. For others, however, this does not seem to be the case. Many times we've seen popular YouTubers constantly collaborating with each other, referencing others in their content over and over, making real-world plans and excursions with each other, and generally developing quite in-depth ties and relationships. Just to clarify, I don't see this as a bad thing inherently. Relationships and building contacts, after all, is important, but I'll cover why I see this trend as a bit odd, for lack of a better word, shortly. It just seems very unusual to me that there is a public perception that, for example, all the self-titled anti-feminist, rationalist, skeptic, atheist-style content creators know each other and talk to each other regularly and all hang out together all the time. Maybe this is a perception born from reality, but it seems unusual that it is instantly cast as a given for anyone entering that particular sphere. Maybe it's the goal and overall plan or motivation for some who join the ever-burgeoning ranks of feminist first-response content creators to do so that they can hang out with their favourite famous people. Who knows? But the point that I find most interesting about this perception, and most strange about it, I suppose, is that many of these content creators who do these frequent collaborations and frequently socialize with each other behind closed doors is that many of these content creators, and indeed audience members who watch them, supported Gamergate, a grassroots consumer movement born from people collaborating and organizing behind closed doors to produce content and friendships and further each other's careers, and the objection that consumers of this media had to that process. Now, obviously the two situations are not directly comparable, but it seems odd that close collaboration between friends in certain spheres is instantly decried as nepotism and cronyism and needs to be driven out, and yet a similar pattern of behaviour is assumed to be the norm in another circumstance and is not questioned. Even the existence of a Skype group featuring dozens of these anti-feminist rationalist skeptics exist, which I was added to and promptly removed myself from. In this group, they share each other's videos and source material and talk about who's going to pwn what and in what way, and share their thoughts and relevant knowledge and experience. And this is not questioned in any way or seen as unusual, given some of their previous convictions regarding behind-the-scenes collaboration of content creators. And I suppose all of this talk brings us nicely to the already covered why topic. the drought of content, or the "you stole this from insert YouTuber name." Again, this is something that comes up every so often when covering certain topics. The inevitability of someone else having already covered the same topic before you. Something I fairly rarely deal with, since most of the time I'm just concerned with covering things that interest me personally, rather than just chasing the latest big scoop of stupidity from the likes of Lacey Green, Anita Sarkeesian, MTV, or BuzzFeed, although sometimes they're just unavoidable. With the seemingly ever-increasing influx of people into the general anti-feminist or some other pseudo-intellectual virtue-signaling buzzword sphere of YouTube, it is inevitable that different people will cover the same topics. Again, certain public perception seems to be that if someone covers something, that instantly puts it off limits to others, for some reason, which again works from the same flawed premise as the aforementioned. The idea that all those operating within these similar spheres all follow each other, all watch each other's stuff, or communicate, or are linked to each other in some capacity. I suppose the conclusion to this is, don't assume that because people move in the same basic sphere of content, or hold similar views, that instantly makes them friends, or that they know each other, or that one even knows that the other exists. And do not assume that because two people hold similar views on a few topics, that necessitates agreement on other topics, or even worse, assume that because of these few agreements that these people must then never disagree on other topics just because you as a viewer feel like there must be some sort of tribe or group identity between those whose content you watch. Don't assume alliances where there are none. It promotes a false and unhealthy sense of community born from fantasy rather than actual bonds forged from trials and life. Also, be aware of the potential for the construction of echo chambers. The predominant culture war at current seems to exist largely between regressive leftists and liberals, attempting to distance themselves from the left, often flying the flag of classical liberal or some other title. This is fine, but be aware that even within this war, most discourse is still taking place under the assumption of a left-leaning banner, which is, in itself, still a form of echo chamber, as it relies on an assumed similar base stance which could potentially cut out other political viewpoints from the get-go. I believe a relevant quote is, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum." A quote that seems to be becoming increasingly relevant as of late, as certain ideas seem to become more and more prominent, and other points of view increasingly taboo within a community that is supposedly open to considering everything equally based on merit and evidence. It is normal for ideas to fall by the wayside owing to lack of evidence, but when ideas begin being put in the wayside due to ideology, emotions, or groupthink, that can lead to problems. Just something to think about going forward. Who do you think is connected to who, and how? Do you know that they are? Or are you just assuming based on a perceived tribal identity? And more importantly, do you think this is a strength or a weakness? Food for thought.